Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, I sat at my desk holding a packet of papers that made my stomach turn, because the math that my sister had been so proud to flaunt in front of our mother for years never added up. And I realized for the first time that what I had suspected all along was not just jealousy or paranoia on my part. It was real, documented, and undeniable. I had always been the daughter who kept her head down, worked steadily, and tried not to stir up drama, while Megan was the shining one, the organizer of family dinners, the woman with the impressive job title at a healthcare nonprofit, the daughter who was praised for handling mom's financial care and who seemed to bask in being the golden child without a shred of guilt. For years, I convinced myself that I should be grateful someone else wanted the spotlight, because it meant I could live quietly without judgment. But the truth is that sitting on the sidelines while your own mother nods along when everyone says how lucky she is to have such a capable firstborn is its own kind of humiliation, the kind that you smile through because fighting back only makes you look bitter. That all started to shift when I looked at the reimbursement logs Megan emailed one Sunday night. A neat spreadsheet of expenses she said she had fronted for mom: groceries, prescriptions, utilities, and each total rounded perfectly to the nearest $10. A detail that might look clean to everyone else, but to me screamed fabrication, because real life never totals like that. I told myself maybe she was just simplifying the math for presentation's sake, but then I noticed that the prescription charges she listed matched days when I knew the refills were delivered by mail, not picked up at the pharmacy. Out of curiosity more than anything, I pulled a stack of mom's old bank statements out of a pantry box, and there it was, clear as daylight. Duplicate charges for the same doctor's visit, the same lab test, even the same utility bill entered twice weeks apart. I kept flipping pages and found transfers marked Med Pickup that occurred the same week the pharmacy shipped directly to mom's door. My chest tightened, because this was not sloppiness, this was intention. I did not storm over to confront her, because yelling only gives her another chance to laugh me off as dramatic. Instead, I went down to mom's local bank branch and asked to speak to someone about recurring payments. That is how I met Ms. Alvarez, the branch manager, who leaned in after glancing at the papers and told me in a steady voice that if I wanted clarity, I should request printed transaction histories straight from their system, not rely on whatever Megan prepared. She showed me how to flag transfers above a certain amount, how to link alerts to my phone, and how to cap automatic withdrawals unless confirmed by voice authorization. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a tool in my hand rather than just suspicions swirling in my head. I kept calm, set up the alerts quietly with mom's permission, and started a folder at home where every questionable charge went, side by side with the actual receipt or absence of one. Each page was like a puzzle piece snapping into place, forming a picture I had dreaded but could no longer deny. I still played my role at family dinners, nodding when Megan bragged about how much time she spent balancing mom's accounts, but every nod was a silent note in my ledger. And even though it burned to keep my mouth shut, I knew that when the time came, proof would speak louder than any accusation. Weeks later, over brunch, Megan pulled out a folder with a notary stamp on the corner of a form, waving it as if it were some trophy showing she had everything under control. Mom smiled and said she did not remember signing anything that day, but Megan brushed it off and poured more coffee. I could not stop looking at that stamp, the date glaring at me, because it was a day I had been with Mom myself, sitting in her living room watching a rerun on television, and I knew she had not left the house. That is when the hair on my arm stood up, and I realized this was no longer about sloppy math or exaggeration. And that is when I understood that the fight ahead would not just be about receipts or rounded numbers, but about signatures, legal authority, and who had been silently pulling the strings behind the curtain all along. When I look back at how the story unfolded, I realized that the hardest part was not uncovering the numbers that did not add up, or even the duplicate receipts that practically screamed manipulation, but rather the endless social game my sister managed to play in every single family setting, where the truth was irrelevant because she had already written the script, cast herself as the hero, and handed the rest of us supporting roles we never auditioned for but somehow accepted. At a cousin's summer barbecue, I remember standing near the grill, pouring drinks for the younger cousins, while Megan stood in the center of a circle with her animated voice and perfect timing, telling everyone how exhausting it was to handle all of Mom's care and finances, how many hours she had spent on the phone with insurance companies, and how proud she was to do it all without complaint, while nods and sympathetic smiles spread across the lawn as though she were carrying the world on her shoulders, rather. Then moving money around with one hand and posting vacation photos with the other. Mom, of course, repeated the line she always used, that Megan had saved her money last year when a supposed crisis hit, and the whole group clapped as though Megan had just announced she was being honored for public service. While I quietly kept count in my head of how many of those hours she claimed to spend coincided with weekends, she had actually been out of state. Aunt Linda, who has always had sharper eyes than she lets on, leaned toward me at one point and whispered whether I noticed that Megan's caregiving weekend lined up perfectly with the beach photos Megan had plastered all over social media. And although I only nodded, inside I felt something solid click into place, because now it was not just me seeing the cracks in her performance, it was someone else, someone who mattered. I did not confront her then, because I had already learned that pushing back in public only made me look resentful, and Megan was too skilled at spinning everything into another example of how difficult I was. Instead, I quietly took note of the details, stored them in my folder, and reminded myself that a story backed by hard facts always lands more powerfully than a rushed accusation. Later that evening, while Megan set down her phone on the patio table to grab a drink, I glanced at the screen and froze when I saw the top line of an email notification: ethics training overdue. It vanished quickly as the screen dimmed, but the phrase lodged in my mind like a thorn, because people in her line of work, healthcare nonprofits, are supposed to have strict compliance rules, and an overdue ethics training might not prove anything on its own. But paired with financial irregularities, it hinted at a pattern. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Megan's entire performance worked only because the family preferred the polished version of the truth to the messy, uncomfortable reality. It was easier to cheer for the daughter who told jokes about pharmacy lines and insurance calls than to face the possibility that money was slipping away in ways no one wanted to believe. And while everyone laughed with her, I was the one who had to live with the gnawing knowledge that every clap, every toast, and every compliment reinforced a story that I knew was false. It was at that point that I decided to move beyond observation and speculation, because I understood that if I wanted to protect Mom, I could not simply collect evidence forever, waiting for the perfect moment. I made an appointment with an elder law attorney, Mr. Chen, who had been recommended by a coworker, and I sat in his office with my folder of receipts, bank statements, and screenshots, feeling both nervous and oddly calm. Because for once I was putting the problem into the hands of someone who would not dismiss me as jealous or bitter. Mr. Chen listened without interrupting, flipped through the papers slowly, and then leaned back in his chair with the kind of deliberate patience that made me realize he had seen cases like this before, even if the family details were always unique. He told me, in plain terms, that if a power of attorney had been signed under circumstances that did not align with what my mother remembered, there was a problem worth addressing, because legal authority over someone's finances must be clear, properly dated, and executed with the signer present. He showed me how a notary stamp should match the signer's own recollection of the day, and how any mismatch could indicate either misrepresentation or outright fabrication. I pulled out the copy of the form Megan had flashed at brunch, and he looked at it for no more than a few seconds before saying a sentence that made my pulse quicken. If this signature happened on that date, someone is lying. That was the moment everything changed, because until then, I had been walking a line between suspicion and proof, between gut feeling and documented evidence. But with that one sentence from a professional whose job it was to know these things, I realized I was not crazy, I was not jealous, I was not inventing stories to make myself feel better. I was standing on solid ground, and for the first time in years, the story was no longer entirely Megan's to tell. When I walked out of Mr. Chen's office with my folder clutched under my arm, I felt the weight of his words echoing in my head. Because once a lawyer looks you in the eye and calmly says that a notarized document does not align with the reality your mother remembers, you cannot go back to pretending that maybe you are overreacting or imagining slights where none exist. And from that moment forward, I knew that what had once felt like a private family tension had become a matter of legal and financial significance, something that had to be addressed before the damage grew even worse. Mr. Chen explained in clear, measured terms that the first step was to confirm my mother's capacity, because if there was even a hint of doubt about whether she had fully understood what she signed, then Megan's power over her finances could spiral into something irreversible, and so he instructed me to arrange an appointment with Mom's doctor, not for medical treatment, but for a capacity evaluation that would serve as a professional statement of her mental clarity. I sat there listening, nodding slowly, while a part of me marveled at how methodical this process was, because unlike the chaos of family arguments or emotional accusations, the law required steady steps, each one documented, signed, and impossible to wave away with a laugh or a sarcastic remark. The doctor's letter arrived within the week, stating plainly that Mom was of sound mind, capable of making her own financial decisions, and that alone gave me leverage, because it meant that any document Megan had presented which suggested otherwise could be challenged. Mr. Chen then walked me through how to revoke an existing power of attorney, explaining that my mother had the right to cancel it at any time so long as she was competent, and that all it required was a properly signed revocation form delivered to the relevant institutions. I remember thinking how astonishing it was that something as heavy as years of manipulation could begin to unravel with a single piece of paper, not shouted arguments or emotional confrontations, but a signed statement that said, in essence, this authority no longer exists. We prepared that form together, making sure Mom understood exactly what she was signing, and then we drafted a new document that required dual acknowledgement for any large financial transfer. A safeguard that meant Megan could no longer move money around with impunity, because every significant action now demanded a second set of eyes. I could see the relief in Mom's face as she signed, because for the first time in years she was not simply handing over trust blindly, she was reclaiming her own role in her financial life, and, while she did not say much, the way her shoulders eased told me more than words could. Armed with the revocation and the new power of attorney, I went back to Ms. Alvarez at the bank, who greeted me with the kind of professional calm that made me feel as though I was not fighting this battle alone anymore. She examined the papers, nodded, and then explained that the bank would now place a temporary freeze on any large transfers until the new authority was fully processed, which meant Megan's freedom to shuffle money was immediately curtailed. She also suggested I submit a compliance report detailing the questionable charges I had already identified, so that the bank's internal team could review them against the official records. I went home that night and spent hours at my kitchen table, lining up receipts with statements, highlighting duplicate charges, and noting the dates that clashed with Megan's own claims of caregiving. The more I organized, the more undeniable it became. Transfers labeled as care on weekends she had been out of town, charges for utilities that had already been paid earlier in the month, and reimbursements for groceries that matched receipts from stores 2 counties away where Mom had never shopped. Each page I added to the compliance packet felt like stacking bricks in a wall that would finally block Megan's constant stream of stories. What struck me most was how casual she had been about it, how in a recorded phone call I made one afternoon, yes, after checking the legality in my state, I caught her breezily admitting that she just fronted costs and caught up later from Mom's account, as though dipping into our mother's money whenever she pleased was nothing more than a flexible arrangement. When I played that recording back, I knew it was not theatrical, not dramatic, just her voice, flat and self-assured, describing exactly what she was doing, and that kind of evidence is the sort that strips away all room for excuses. With the doctor's letter, the revocation, the new power of attorney, the bank freeze, the compliance packet, and the recording, I was no longer standing in the shadow of her performance, waiting for someone to believe me. I had assembled a case that could not be laughed off at a barbecue or brushed aside with a sarcastic smile. Late in the afternoon, as I was stapling the last set of papers, my phone buzzed with a call from the courier service Mr. Chen had recommended. The man's voice was calm and professional as he told me, "Your documents were delivered and signed for today, and tomorrow the formal notices will go out." I sat there at the kitchen table staring at the stack of papers, feeling the weight of what that meant, because once those notices were mailed, Megan would be forced to confront the reality that her authority had been stripped, that her freedom to manipulate the narrative with paperwork was over, and that her carefully maintained image as the flawless daughter was about to collide with facts she could not bend. For the first time, I was not afraid of what would happen when she found out, because I understood that this was no longer just a family dispute but a matter of documented truth, and the envelope that would land in her hands would not be something she could charm, twist, or laugh away. The night of my mother's anniversary dinner arrived with that same familiar sense of tension that always seemed to hang in the air whenever the extended family gathered, because while the occasion was supposed to be about celebration and gratitude, everyone already knew that Megan would somehow position herself at the center of attention, collecting compliments for her endless sacrifices while I sat quietly in the corner, nodding along and pretending not to notice how easily I was erased from the narrative. The restaurant was buzzing with conversation, relatives lifting glasses in anticipation of toasts, but I was oddly calm, almost detached, because I knew that no matter what happened during the small talk and the polite chatter, the real moment had nothing to do with appetizers or champagne. It had to do with the envelope I carried in my bag, a slim packet of papers that carried more weight than any speech I could deliver, and I had decided that when the time was right, it would not be my voice that spoke, but the truth written in black and white. Megan was in her element from the moment she walked in, greeting everyone with hugs, recounting her latest work achievement, reminding the table how hard she had fought to secure better care for Mom, and weaving stories with just the right balance of humility and pride to keep everyone nodding as though they were in the presence of a saint. I had seen this performance too many times to count, and it no longer made me angry. It simply confirmed that she had rehearsed her role so long that she believed it herself, and the family was more than willing to applaud, because applauding was easier than asking questions. My father, as always, sat quietly, smiling faintly but never interfering, while Aunt Linda observed from her seat with that sharp look in her eyes that told me she was waiting, not for the show, but for the cracks in it. Dinner moved along predictably, plates passed around, wine poured generously, until the moment everyone knew was coming, the point when Mom, tipsy with attention and affection, raised her glass to make her yearly speech. She looked around the table, her eyes lingering on Megan, and with a broad smile she said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that her eldest daughter was the only one who had made her truly proud. The words stung, not because they were new, I had heard variations of them all my life, but because of the ease with which they were delivered, the casual cruelty of erasing me while I sat just a few chairs away. The table erupted in cheers, glasses clinking, everyone congratulating Megan as though the declaration had been earned beyond dispute, and for a few seconds I simply sat there, letting the noise wash over me, waiting until the clamor began to fade. I pushed my chair back, not hurriedly or angrily but with deliberate calm, and stood up. The room quieted slightly, not because they expected me to speak, but because it was unusual for me to break the rhythm of the evening. Without raising my voice, I placed the envelope on the table in front of Mom and said one sentence that cut through the chatter like a blade. Interesting, since this was delivered about her just yesterday. I did not need to say more, because the weight of those words drew every eye to the envelope, and silence spread as curiosity pushed aside celebration. Mom reached for it slowly, her hands trembling slightly, and as she slid the papers out, the table leaned closer, the cheers forgotten. Inside were 3 documents. First, the revocation of the old power of attorney, properly notarized and signed, confirming that from now on Megan no longer held authority over Mom's finances. Second, the demand letter from the bank's compliance department, listing the flagged transactions and requesting clarification and repayment for transfers that had been deemed irregular. And third, a formal acknowledgement from Megan's own nonprofit employer, stating that their ethics office had received a complaint and opened a preliminary review into her conduct. Each page was simple, clinical, and devastating because, unlike family stories, they carried official seals and signatures that no amount of charm could erase. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was not hostile, but heavy, as though everyone was recalibrating their understanding of the woman they had just finished applauding. Mom's face shifted from confusion to disbelief as she scanned the words, and I could see her lips move as she tried to process the contrast between what she had just said and what she was reading. Megan's smile, which had been painted on since the beginning of the night, faltered for the first time, though she quickly reached for the envelope with a practiced air of control, laughing lightly and insisting this was clearly a misunderstanding, some bureaucratic mix-up that would be resolved in no time. But the edges of her voice betrayed her, the polish slipping just enough for those who were listening closely to catch it. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not present a speech cataloging every questionable receipt and suspicious transfer I had uncovered, because I knew that drowning the table in words would only give Megan a stage to perform on. Instead, I stayed quiet, letting the paper speak, letting the authority of the institutions carry the weight I no longer needed to shoulder. Aunt Linda was the first to break the silence, clearing her throat and saying, almost casually, that she remembered very well the weekend Megan claimed she was caring for Mom, because she had personally lent Megan her travel points for a beach trip that same weekend, and the reminder hung in the air like a verdict no one wanted to deliver out loud. My father set his fork down, his face unreadable, while Mom's eyes flicked between me and Megan, her voice unsteady as she asked if it was true, if the money had really been taken without her knowledge. Megan tried to smile, tried to explain, but the documents lay on the table like immovable proof, and for once, her words could not outrun the evidence. I did not push further, because I understood the power of restraint, the impact of letting the silence stretch just long enough for the truth to sink in. And then, as if the evening needed one final twist, the restaurant door opened and in walked Ms. Alvarez, the branch manager from Mom's bank, who had agreed to meet me there in case any questions arose about the legitimacy of the documents. Her presence alone, calm and professional, erased any remaining doubt, because she represented something beyond family drama. She represented the cold certainty of records and compliance. She approached the table, greeted my mother politely, and confirmed that the letter was indeed genuine and routine, not an error, and that further steps would follow. In that instant, the entire room shifted. The golden child, the flawless daughter, the one everyone clapped for, was suddenly not untouchable, and the version of the truth she had curated for years had cracked wide open. I sat back down, folded my hands in my lap, and said nothing more, because the envelope had already spoken louder than I ever could. When Ms. Alvarez finished speaking and stepped back with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivers facts for a living, the table did not erupt or splinter or explode the way I had once imagined during late nights when anger kept me awake. Instead, there was that suspended quiet that follows a sudden downpour, where everyone is still calculating what just happened and who they become now that it has, and in that quiet my mother turned toward Megan with a face that held something I had not seen since we were children, not fury or performance or the soft haze of denial, but a clear, simple question that refused to be redirected, because she asked her eldest daughter whether she had taken money before asking, whether she had signed things without explaining, whether she had used the authority my mother had given her as a pass to do whatever seemed convenient, while telling everyone how heavy the burden was, and in that directness Megan, who had always been fluent in charm and implication and tidily packaged half-truths, finally stumbled. What followed was not a confession and certainly not an apology. It was an attempt at a narrative pivot, the familiar claim that everything had been for Mom's benefit, that reimbursements are messy, that the bank makes errors and compliance letters mean nothing, that notary dates can be misunderstood, that the ethics office at her nonprofit routinely opens reviews because that is just what they do, and while some of that may hold a grain of procedural truth, the problem for her was that the Room had already changed shape, the force field around her cracked, and her words no longer had the unchallenged glide they used to. Because the papers on the table and the memory of her beach weekend and the round totals and the duplicated bills and the recorded call where she described catching up later from Mom's account all sat there like furniture you cannot pretend you do not see. I remember looking at my father and recognizing that tired, pained look of a man who hates conflict so much he would rather spend the evening fixing things that are not broken in the garage than talk about one thing that is broken at the table. And I spared him the speech I had once rehearsed in my mind, because it was not needed now that the system I had built was in motion, a clean, boring, bulletproof system that made argument pointless. I turned to my mother instead and told her in a voice that stayed steady only because I held on to the chair beneath the table, that tomorrow her new card with a modest daily limit would be in her wallet, that weekly printed statements would arrive whether or not anyone remembered to ask for them, that reimbursements for caregiving would only be paid after invoices were verified and matched to dates and locations and services, that large transfers would never leave her account without her clear consent and a second signature, and that if Megan wanted to be involved it would have to be as a grown woman operating under the same rules everyone else follows, not as a special daughter who gets to rewrite reality. To my surprise, my mother did not argue or demand a private talk or make me promise to stop embarrassing the family. She touched the edge of the bank letter with that careful hand she uses when she is afraid something might break. And in that small gesture I understood that while she may never say the words I once craved, she was stepping with me onto solid ground, and that was more useful than any public mea culpa that would vanish by morning. Aunt Linda, who always knows exactly when to break tension without minimizing it, offered a half smile and said she would drive Mom to the bank next week to finalize anything that needed signatures, and the way my mother nodded told me she welcomed help that did not come with strings. Megan tried one last time to reclaim the room, saying that I had blindsided her, that this was cruel, that I had turned a family celebration into an ambush, and in another year that accusation would have worked, because I would have been the one apologizing for tone or timing while the substance slipped through our fingers again. Instead, I met her eyes and, without heat, told her that what happened at the table was not a trial and not a punishment. It was simply the end of a chapter where stories outran receipts, that from now on she was free to be as devoted as she liked as long as devotion arrived with documentation. That if she wanted to repair trust she could start by responding to the bank's questions and cooperating with her employer's review, and that I would not debate any of it over dinner because debate was the tool that had kept us all stuck for years. The meal resumed in that strange way families have of continuing to eat after a revelation, forks moving and glasses refilling while everyone's minds are elsewhere, and when we finally stood to leave, my mother squeezed my hand in the hallway by the restrooms and said in a thin voice that she was very tired and very relieved, and that tomorrow she wanted to go buy a small notebook where she would write down every bill she paid. And I told her I would bring one in the morning along with tea and the first set of statements printed neatly in a folder that she could keep in the pantry with the others. And even though she did not say thank you, I could feel something loosen between us. Not the forced closeness of the past, but the steadier feeling that comes when you pick up tools together and agree to build something sturdy. As for Megan, she sent me a message that night full of wounded pride and vague threats about lawyers and reputation, and how I would regret humiliating her, and I replied only with a screenshot of the revocation page, the doctor's capacity letter, and the line in the bank notice that listed due dates for response, because I have finally learned that the most effective language with her is the language of systems and deadlines rather than emotion and pleading, and after that she went quiet, which, if you know her, is not defeat, it is calculation, but I am fine with that because I am no longer playing her game on her terms. When I drove my mother home, I set the envelope on her kitchen counter, opened the top drawer, and placed her new card beside the pad of sticky notes she uses for grocery lists, explaining in a calm voice how the daily limit works and how any exception requires a call she will have to approve with a simple yes or no, and while I spoke I realized that this was the real revenge. Not the spectacle at dinner or the moment the room went silent, but the quiet installation of a framework that makes Exploitation difficult, the restoration of my mother's agency, the end of a long season where love meant letting someone else hold the keys. I left her standing in the doorway with the porch light on. And as I walked to my car, I felt no triumphal music and no blaze of vindication, only that steady confidence you get when you stop trying to be believed and start making the truth easy to read. And if there is a price for that choice, it is one I will pay. Because tonight I did not win an argument. I changed the rules, and that is what finally set us free.